Determine the left-sided limit and the right-sided limit in the two-sided limit as x approaches pi over 2 of -3 secant of x. Each of these involves the limit as x approaches pi over 2 of -3 secant of x. The first thing to do is try plugging a pi over 2 in for x. That will give a -3 secant of pi over 2, which is equal to -3 times the secant of pi over 2 is 1 divided by the cosine of pi over 2. The cosine of pi over 2 is 0, so 1 divided by 0. We can multiply the numerators. -3 times a 1 is a -3 over the 0. The 0 in the denominator is not actually a 0 since x is only approaching pi over 2. It doesn't reach pi over 2. But a limit result of a non-zero number divided by 0 is equal to positive infinity or negative infinity, where the sign of the infinity often depends on the side the limit is approaching from. We will therefore have to work out each of the one-sided limits separately. We have the left-sided limit indicated by the negative superscript on the pi over 2. And the right-sided limit indicated by the positive superscript on the pi over 2. Let's start with the left-sided limit. First thing to do is to rewrite the trig function so that we can see where the 0 in the denominator is coming from. Secant of x is equal to 1 over the cosine of x. We can now multiply the numerators. -3 times 1. To give a -3 over the cosine of x. Cosine of x is what is making 0 in the denominator here, because the cosine of pi over 2 is a 0. This is the left-sided limit. We're going to analyze what happens with the cosine on the left side of pi over 2. The left side of pi over 2 means an angle less than pi over 2. On the unit circle, less than pi over 2, but close to pi over 2, is in the first quadrant. And in the first quadrant, the cosine is a positive number. As it approaches to pi over 2, cosine will approach to a 0, but it will be a positive number the entire time. So we can replace the cosine of x with a positive 0. The result of this will be a -3 over a positive 0. A negative divided by a positive is a negative. A non-zero over 0 is an infinity. And there's the result of the left-sided limit. The right-sided limit can work out in a similar fashion. Rewrite the secant as 1 over the cosine. Multiply the numerators. This time it's approaching pi over 2 from the right side, so the cosine of x down here will be evaluated for an angle that's slightly larger than pi over 2. On the unit circle, that puts it into the second quadrant. In the second quadrant, cosine is a negative. But it's still approaching pi over 2, so it's going to still approach a value of 0, however, from the negative side, so it can be replaced with now a -0. So the result of this will be a -3 over a -0. The negatives cancel to become positive. A non-zero over 0 is an infinity. And there's the result of the right-sided limit. The two-sided limit depends on the results of the two one-sided limits. They do not match each other here. So the two-sided limit will come out to up here. Does not exist. And there's the results of the three different limits.